Shalom. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Scott with Beth, Yeshua, Messianic Synagogue in Fort Myers, Florida. Thank you for joining us. This is our midweek Torah study. We are working our way through the Torah week by week, parsha by parsha. This week we are in Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 1. Vayikra, he called or called. We begin with a couple of business items. First of all, if you are in Southwest Florida and would like to fellowship with us, would like to visit us, we would be glad to have you. Our synagogue services are Shabbat at 11 a.m., and you're welcome to join us. We get visitors all the time, and we are open for in-person services, and would love to have you join us. The second item, if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, this allows you to see our synagogue services, Shabbat services that are broadcast, streamed on YouTube, and allows you to get a notification that we are broadcasting, and that's helpful. Also, we have other teachings that are published on this channel, and it allows you to receive notifications about all those. So it's a good way to stay in touch. So subscribe. There we go. And lastly, for all those who are interested, if you would like to reach out and discuss or have questions or comments, please do. My email address is listed in the description below this video, so I would love to do that with you. We're having some technical difficulties. I'm still questioning whether to go ahead with tonight's recording, but we're going to see and see how it goes. Maybe this just goes offline. We'll see. All right. Last thing I would like to say is if you are supporting our ministry, thank you so much for your gifts and tithes and love offerings. If you would like to, there is a link in the description below for you to give to this ministry. This ministry is entirely supported by your gifts and offerings. So thank you, and blessings may Adonai bless and increase the work of your hands for those who give in faith during these days. Okay, let's begin with a summary. We're going to go ahead and summarize this week's Torah portion, Vayikra, chapter 1 through chapter 5. The book of Vayikra, Leviticus, where we start reading this week, is known as the Law of the Kohanim, the Law of the Priests. It deals largely with the korbanot, the offerings that are brought to the Mishkan, the tent of meeting. The first group of offerings are called the olot, the burnt offerings. The animal is brought to the entrance of the Mishkan. Regarding cattle, the one who brings the offering sets his hands on the animal. Afterwards, the animal is slaughtered, and the Kohen sprinkles its blood upon the altar. The animal is skinned and cut into pieces. The pieces are arranged, washed, and burned on the altar. A similar process is described involving burnt offerings of other animals and birds. The various meal offerings are also described. Part of these are burned on the altar, and the remainder is eaten by the Kohanim. Mixing leaven or mixing honey into the offerings is prohibited. The peace offering, part of which is burnt on the altar and part of which is eaten, can be either from cattle, from sheep, or from goats. The Torah prohibits eating blood or chelev, certain fats from certain animals. The offerings that atone for inadvertent sins committed by the high priest, by the entire community, by the king, and by the average citizen are described. Laws of guilt offerings, which atone for certain transgressions, for laws of ritual purity, etc., are listed, transgressing vows, etc. The meal offering for those who cannot afford the normal guilt offering is described. The offering to atone for sanctified property, korbanot, laws of questionable guilt offerings, and offerings for dishonesty are also detailed. Summary provided this week by Or Sameach. If you're looking for a summary, consider Or Sameach because they have a great deal of teaching online and a yeshiva in Jerusalem and so on and so forth. So let me know if you're interested in that, and I'll pass along that information. We begin the book of Vayikra, Leviticus, and it's about lots of laws and sacrifices. It's about a lot of regulations and rules and requirements on these sacrifices. I want to bring to your attention one way of understanding this, quite fascinating. We're going to rewind to the book of Shemot, Exodus, one chapter to the left, Exodus chapter 40. The end of Exodus, it ends with these words, "Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, the glory of Adonai filled the tabernacle," verse 35. Moses was unable to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud resided there, and the glory of Adonai filled the tabernacle. Now whenever the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, Bnei Israel went onward throughout all their journeys. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not move out until that day, till the day that it was. For the cloud of Adonai was on the tabernacle by day, and a fire was there by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys. So what we see here is the description of the cloud and the fire there in the Mishkan, and how people of Israel followed this cloud. And if the cloud settled, they didn't go, and if the cloud went up, they went up. They traveled. This was their travel requirements. This is how they moved and how it worked. But so that's the end of Exodus. That's the last words out of Exodus. We get into Leviticus, and we describe all these offerings and sacrifices. And I want you to fast forward all the way through Leviticus to Numbers, Bamidbar, the next book, and all the way out to chapter 9. And we see this, an echo of what we just read. Verse 34 again of chapter 9. The cloud covered the tent of meeting. Interesting. 34 of chapter 40 of Exodus. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting. Verse 34 of Numbers 9. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting. We see this. It's almost verbatim. I'm trying to look. I think there's one word or a couple words that are different between the Exodus 40 and Numbers chapter 9. And then we have this, Numbers chapter 10, the next chapter. On the 20th day of the second month of the second year, the cloud lifted up from above the tabernacle of the testimony. Then Bnei Israel set out on their journeys in the Sinai wilderness. The cloud came to rest in the wilderness of Paran, so they set out for the first time by the mouth of Adonai by Moses' hand. So we see the entire book of Leviticus and all the way through chapter 9 into Numbers chapter 10. There was no narrative of movement or travel or journey. They were stationary. They were building the Mishkan. They were dedicating the Mishkan. They were getting organized. Adonai chose to organize the Torah in this way. There is much discussion of why we have this interlude of all these sacrifices here in this particular place. You would think if you're telling a narrative, you'd just go from narrative to narrative to narrative. That would be the most, certainly perhaps, you would think, the most productive way to teach the narrative. But we have an interlude here of an entire book plus 9 chapters. We know that Adonai organized it deliberately this way. So we're going to try to draw out of Vayikra, draw out of Leviticus, a real discussion that is meaningful and connective. And in some of this, we have to lay a background and a baseline in order to do this. But if you will, I think you'll find it helpful. First of all, let's look at a broad outline of the book of Vayikra. We begin with the Korbanot, and then we go, in chapter 8, we go to the installation of the Kohanim, the priests. Chapters 9 and 10, we talk about the establishment and the invocation of the Mishkan, the week of sacrifices and so forth around the consecration of the Mishkan. Then we go into chapters 11 through 15 with various sources of impurity, which render a person unfit to approach Adonai in the Mishkan. Then we go to chapters 16, the purification of the Mishkan, the days of the covering, and then we go to laws related to offerings. Chapters 18 through 20, the sanctification of the people. Chapters 21 and 22, the sanctification of the priests, the Kohanim. Chapter 23, and this is that Leviticus 23, which is where we get our calendar and where we follow carefully to keep the feasts and keep Adonai's calendar. And we have this in chapter 23, Leviticus 23. 24, we have additional offerings. 25, we have the sanctification of the land when you come into the land. and then covenantal blessings and warnings, and then in chapter 27, sanctified objects. In English, or in summary here, we have this sort of walk through these rules all around the sacrifice. In English, sacrifice, the word sacrifice frequently denotes or describes a disadvantaged exchange, or perhaps no exchange whatsoever. In other words, the exchange is such that one party is well off and the other party's disadvantaged. If a rich man were to sell his house to a poor man, he might charge that poor man $1 as a show of a transaction, as a show of dignity. This would be called a sacrifice. A mother who gives up her life to raise her children, she certainly sacrifices her life, but she gets less in return from her children, perhaps. But again, these are examples of exchanges, and in the English understanding of this, we have this idea that a sacrifice is a kind of exchange. Motivations for sacrifice, benefits that come from sacrifices. Again, the benefits that come from sacrifices could be described as an explanation of this exchange, of detailing some kind of exchange within this. But there are also motivations for sacrifices: love, kindness, compassion, noble virtue, what is best for the community, etc. There's a sense in which these are all sort of motivations, and reasonable motivations, we would think, for sacrifice. But there is one sense in which all these are entirely unlike the sacrifices in Leviticus. Excuse me. In Leviticus, the word is korban or korbanot. In verse 2, speak to Bnei Israel, chapter 1, verse 2 of Vayikra, Leviticus. Speak to Bnei Israel and tell them, when any one of you brings an offering to Adonai, you may present your offering of livestock from the herd or from the flock. In the Hebrew, it's saying this from the very beginning. When any one of you brings an offering, is how we translate it here in the, this is the Tree of Life Bible. So, in Hebrew, Adam ki yachrib mekem korban. When any one of you brings of you an offering, yachrib and korban are of the same root word, the Hebrew word karab, to come near, to approach. So we could literally translate this from verse 2. When someone comes close with a closeness, or when somebody approaches to be close. The meaning of the korbanot, the offerings and the sacrifice, is closeness. The meaning of the word is closeness. And it's not just the meaning of the word, it's not just what the word actually means. It is the purpose. The purpose of the sacrifices is to create closeness. You are going to create an effect of closeness in that you are approaching Adonai with this sacrifice. You're approaching Adonai to come close to Him in His sanctuary, and you're bringing this sacrifice. It is the sacrifice is going to be part of this sort of moment as you come close to Adonai. But also, the sacrifices are a product of closeness, and this is a different way to understand it, because they live in proximity with the presence of Adonai. Remember the Mishkan, Adonai is in the midst of them in the Mishkan. The Mishkan is in the midst of the camp. It's right smack in the center of the camp. And so they are living in proximity with the presence of Adonai. They are close to Adonai. The sacrifices are a product of that closeness, in that the sacrificial system is necessary because of the closeness. That is, when you came into the presence, as the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, would go into the presence of Adonai on the Yom Kippur, the day of the covering, and he would go through a great deal of complex ritual in order to cleanse himself, in order to be in the presence of Adonai. He was going to be that close, so he had to make the sacrifices. and then we have this: the sacrifices are a compelling. The sacrifices are themselves a drawing unto closeness. The sacrifices will bring you. Now I have a reason, an undeniable summons. The sacrifices will summons me to come into the presence of Adonai with a sacrifice. It is a way of this is very casual, but if my mother sends me a card, it compels me to give her a call. If my mother calls me and leaves me a voicemail, it compels me to call her. And so I'm sure that's why she does those things from time to time. Do you see? It compels a response. It compels a reason to come in to the presence of Adonai. You don't get to make a sacrifice without being present and without being engaged and without being fully involved in this moment of the sacrifice. But now look at this verse I want to share with you from the Birchadashah from Hebrews chapter 9, from the Living Tree of Life, from the Tree of Life version, chapter 9, verse 23. Therefore it was necessary for the replicas of these heavenly things to be purified with these sacrifices, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Messiah did not enter the holies made with hands, counterparts of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in God's presence on our behalf. What a profound thing. Have you thought of this? Verse 24, the Messiah never went into the Holy of Holies. He never went into the most holy place in the temple. He never went in. That just strikes you as interesting, doesn't it? What do we think of this? But more so, what I wanted to bring to your attention in this Hebrews chapter 9, let's read this from Young's literal translation. It is necessary, therefore, the pattern better sacrifices than these. For not into holy places made with hands did the Messiah enter, figures of the true, but into the heaven itself, now to be manifested in the presence of God for us. One more, Green's literal translation, which is one that I'm reading a little bit of lately. Then it was needful for the figures of the things in the heavens to be cleansed with these, but the heavenly things themselves by better sacrifices than these. The last one I'll share with you is MJLT. This is Kevin Jeffrey's translation. It is therefore indeed necessary for the pattern of the things in the heavens to be purified with these sacrifices. He inserts that word sacrifices there. And for the heavenly things themselves to be purified with sacrifices better than these. Why am I sharing this with you? For Messiah did not enter into the holy places made with hands, which are mere depictions of the true holy place, because Hebrews 9 here, the author is giving us a hint about what's going on in the heavenlies. We're getting a hint here about what's happening in the heavenly places. Into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of Adonai for us. The earthly things to be purified. What is it referring to? The pattern of things in the heavens to be purified with these sacrifices. The pattern of things in the heavens is the earthly things. It is necessary for these things, the figures of the things in the heavens, says Young's literal translation, or the pattern. Young's says the pattern indeed of the things in the heavens. What is the pattern of the things in the heavens? It is the things in the Mishkan. It is the layout and the diagram of the Mishkan. It is the showbread. It is the altar of incense. It is the cheruvim on the of the ark. This is what we see. What I'm saying here, what I'm suggesting here, is that the author is giving us a hint that the same Mishkan / temple / most holy place that we have here on the earth is a copy of some most holy place in heaven itself. And it was into this holy place, not made with hands, that Messiah himself appears in the presence of Adonai on our behalf. The heavenly things were the originals of which the Mishkan and the temple were and contained copies thereof. The better sacrifice described here in chapter 9 is the blood sacrifice of Yeshua. It is better because the heavenly realm requires a greater sacrifice here. It is a sacrifice of a son, and this is how the Son has earned his place to come into the presence of Adonai, because he gave him of himself for his brothers. So this is what we see. The better sacrifice is offered here. It is the blood of Yeshua. It is in the place of the original, that is the heavenly place, the most holy place in the heavens. That is in the presence of Adonai himself. Okay. And this is better because the heavenly realm requires a greater sacrifice. It requires the sacrifice of a son, as I just said. Okay. All right, let's move on a little bit here. Just a little summary of what's happening here. Thanks to Rabbi at Shalom, who kind of did a really simple breakdown of this, which I appreciated. So let's walk through this real quickly. There are effectively in 4 basic types of the sacrifices. Now, for the sacrifices, we have the korbanot, which I mentioned earlier, which is this verse 1 or verse 2 of Leviticus chapter 1. When any one of you brings an offering, and in the Hebrew, yakrib mekem korban, who brings an offering, this yakrib and korban being this closeness. So you could say that when anyone comes close with a closeness, or when anyone comes close with this sort of offering. But what is the offering specifically? It is a slaughtering. It is zevachim, slaughterings. There are 4 basic types of zevachim, these slaughterings, and we'll just walk through them effectively. The first is the olah. Olah means to go up, or to rise up. It's referred to frequently as the burnt offering, as in the smoke from the offering rises up to Adonai. This offering, called the Olah offering, is completely burnt on the altar except for the hide, the skin. Thus it totally rises to Adonai. Only male animals, doves or pigeons, are acceptable in this offering. The second of the zevachim is called the shlamim. Shlamim, from shalem or shalom, presents many different understandings. It may have to do with shalom being peace, which we would attribute to that word in all cases. Satisfaction, peace, goodwill, etc. And of course, to combine this with the zevachim, the shlamim offering, it would convey a sense of being at peace with Adonai. Of course, it could also be considered a gift or a greeting to Adonai, or the shlamim is considered a complete offering. Male and female animals are acceptable. No birds. Certain fat internal organs are placed on the altar. The remainder, almost the whole animal, is permitted to be eaten. In Vayikra, the Torah ordains that any pure person is permitted to partake of the shlamim, thus allowing the donor to share it with the family and invitees. So what we see here is you're going to make the shlamim offering, the shlamim, and this is a slaughtering, this is zevachim, so you're going to make the shlamim sacrifice, and you're going to bring a group, and you're going to all partake of the peace offering, the peace sacrifice. You share it with your family, with your friends. Eating of the shlamim is permitted during the day and the night of the actual sacrifice, and one day following. It was not restricted to being at the sanctuary. It could be eaten in your homes. The Thanksgiving offering, which was a part of the shlamim, is an exception because it's only allowed to be eaten in the day of its offering and the night following. So you figure like a 24-hour, or just the day and the night of that actual offering, which is really kind of an interesting thing. The Todah, it's something that applies in the immediacy because we are so frequently we lose the taste of the Torah. Have you ever noticed this phenomenon? You haven't had a steak in 3 or 4 months, and you're going to have a steak at your favorite restaurant, and your mouth is watering because you've been waiting for several months for this steak, and you take your first bite into this steak, and you begin to chew, and you have nothing but absolute satisfaction in that steak. It's everything that you've been waiting for, everything that you've wanted. And you take the second bite, and it's just as good in the third and the fourth. But somewhere, as you begin to work your way through that 8-ounce steak or whatever your portion is, somewhere in that process, the steak loses its flavor, it loses its taste, because our taste buds have a kind of memory, a kind of taste memory, in that we kind of lose the sense. It loses its newness to us. And find that we I seem to be having some more technical difficulties. I'm very sorry. Let's see if it stabilizes here. So my point with the steak seems to lose its newness to you. It loses its flavor to you almost. And that, in a sense, is like the Thanksgiving offering. If I say thanks for something, pretty quickly I lose my connection to what I was grateful for. That my thanks offering, my thanksgiving, is only valid for a short period of time, because my memory fades, my thoughts of it fade. For example, I thank my wife for doing this or that for me, and I thank her, and I try to thank her many times every day. I need to always remember to do this. But if I forget, then I kind of take advantage of her. I'm just kind of assuming that she's always there, and somewhat, she's very busy, of course, with our family, but she's always somewhat available to me, and I could easily take that for granted. But for me to say thank you for, answering my question, thank you for doing that for me, thank you for making my dinner and making me a meal. She's certainly busy enough that she could fill that time with other things. But no, do you see this idea of the Torah being an offering of the day? It's an offering that we make verbally to Adonai every day. Okay. The sages teach us that we need to give gratitude 100 times a day, that you don't begin to step into fellowship with Adonai until you've given him gratitude and thanksgiving 100 times a day. Okay, that was the Torah. Let's see. An individual's olah and shlamim are both voluntary offerings, sacrifices. Although their names may connote certain purposes, and forgiveness of sins was mentioned in connection with the olah, the reasons why one may bring an olah are not given. Note that the sages provide several explanations, notably that it is forms of forgiveness for neglected commandments and so forth. But there's no real textual mention of that here. And this is my interpretation of that. The olah offering, being an offering voluntary, it's the form of an offering that would require you to be voluntary, because you're giving all of it, and you have nothing to gain here. It is the ultimate sort of sacrifice. The shlamim offering, of course, has to be voluntary because it represents a meal. When other than your childhood, when were you forced to eat a meal with somebody? No, it has to be voluntary, otherwise it doesn't work. Okay, moving on. Chatat, the sin offering, referring to the unintentional sins, those that had been done intentionally, are culpable are managed and handled. Carelessness and inadvertence indicate a laxness and negligence. These kinds of transgressions defile the sanctuary in the midst of the people. Adonai is asking the people to be very conscientious and very careful people. The chatat brings purification and forgiveness to the sanctuary. It's a mandatory part of an unintentional sinner's repentance process. With the exception of the asham, which was brought for withholding testimony. Some of you may remember we say the asham nu during Yom Kippur. Brought for withholding testimony, and intentional sins cannot be expiated here by means of these sacrifices. 4 classes of chatat, varying according to the offender's status and without reference to the transgressions, are given. Those of the Kohen Gadol, those of the whole community of Israel, and those of the king or the prince, the Nasi, and those of an individual. From the sanctuary perspective, that is the community, the Mishkan, etc., the first two, the Kohen Gadol and the community of Israel, reflect a graver transgression, a graver impact, impacting the spiritual welfare of the nation. There's a vulnerability that we see requiring an elaborate ritual of sacrifice of a young bull and the blood sprinkling on the parachet veil and upon the incense altar, as well as the bronze altar, and the burning of the complete bull on the ash heap outside the camp. The latter two, that of the king and the individual, lack these sort of requirements. After all, the Nasi is not an official religious leader. The king is a political leader. He brings a male goat, while the private individual brings a female goat or ewe. Male Kohanim eat from these later offerings within sanctuary precincts. 3 particular transgressions of omission that require a chatat offering for forgiveness are also given. One who withholds testimony, various cases of being impure in a span of forgetting and entering the sanctuary or eating the sacred items, inadvertently violating an oath, and so forth and so on. Depending on financial ability, one either comes with a female sheep or a goat or birds or flour. In the latter case, oil and frankincense are withheld, reflecting the severe nature of the moment. Number 4, the fourth category of these zevachim. The fourth category of the zevachim, the sacrifices, the slaughterings, is the asham, or the guilt offerings. And this breaks down into 3 different classes according to Rabbi at Shalom. An unintentional misappropriation for personal use of the sanctuary. The violator makes full restitution, pays his penalties. The second one is the contingency, where one has a doubt if he committed an unintentional transgression, and to be certain he goes through the chatat. And the third is the trespass against God, in that one lied under oath, defrauding, etc. Let's look at the first 3 zevachim, the olah, the shlamim, and the chatat. Where do we find the beginning of all these together and individually? Where was our character found with all 3 of these attributes or descriptions? And what I would submit to you is that these are all expressed in the narrative of the tree, the garden, with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil is an off-limit tree. It is outside the boundary of what is permitted to us. What do we see in the garden? We see a boundary, and in that boundary, within that boundary of the garden, we are allowed, and within that we have fellowship with Adonai. There is a boundary between what is outside the garden and what is inside the garden. We know this because there was 2 angels, cheruvim, who were guarding the entrance to the garden after Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden. So we know that it was a defined space. It had a boundary. Within this boundary, Adam and Eve, prior to the fall, were allowed to be. It was where they belonged. And then within this were trees that were considered permissible, and there was another tree that was considered impermissible. You were not allowed to eat of it. It is an off-limits tree, subject to Adonai and pending the proper dispensing of the tree in the future. If that was Adonai's plan, we don't know. So what do we see happening here is the sense of the sin, which was taking of the what didn't belong to us, in a sense of crossing a boundary. We ate food that was reserved unto Adonai, that was prohibited from us. We crossed a boundary into a space that wasn't allowed for us, or into an activity or something that wasn't allowed to us. That is, eating the fruit of this tree. And for that, we have the chatat, sin offering, which is the offering which removes our sin. We have the shlamim offering, which is the peace offering. When Adam and Eve were found to be without clothes and they were ashamed, Adonai gave an offering of clothes by virtue of this shlamim. It is a peace offering. They are no longer naked. They can live and be unashamed. Do you see that? That is something that Adonai brought to them and met them with. He could have left them to their own devices. They certainly managed to sew some fig leaves together through some sort of creativity. He could have let them manage on their own. Instead, we have the shlamim, the peace offering, sacrifice. And then lastly is the olah offering, and that is what is entirely consumed, what is entirely burnt up, and the animal that was entirely consumed is the one that was sacrificed in the garden in order for them to have these skins, which incidentally, once again, the Torah prescribes that in the olah offering, where does the skin go? The skin goes to the priest. In the olah offering in the garden, if you want to look at it this way, where did the skin go? The skin went to Adam and Eve. That's my teaching. There may be some that object to that. That may be a little loose with the context, if that's where you are. But I would submit to you that the compelling, overwhelming truth is that indeed the skin was necessary in order to remove shame. And there is no greater peace offering than to give up something to remove shame. I would submit to you. Okay. Other than disobedience, what else did Adam and Eve do? What else did Eve and subsequently Adam find themselves doing other than just flat out disobedience? Well, they were taking something that didn't belong to them, but that probably was going to be apportioned to them at a later time. Speaking of this tendency, we have this tendency to take what is ours before it belongs to us. Imagine, if you will, a young man and young woman who are thinking marriage down the road, and perhaps they're just seeing each other. In our society, in our culture, they may consider it free to take certain liberties with each other. They would take what doesn't belong to them. They would take intimacy from this partner before it belongs to them, before it's appropriate. We find ourselves doing this all the time in our lives. A thing may be destined to us, but to take it too soon is devastating to ourselves and to the other person. The sacrifices are effective at reestablishing these boundaries. In other words, if you look at this from a case of boundary, of what belongs to Adonai, what belongs to us, what belongs to other people, the sacrifices reestablish these boundaries. We sacrifice the olah, zevachim, the slaughtering, the olah offering. It reestablishes a boundary of everything that goes up to Adonai. This is all yours. Everything in this space belongs to you. The shlamim offering, rather, is just the offering that we eat with the priest. This belongs to both the priest and to us. We share this. The chatat offering belongs just to the priest. Just the priest eats this. So do you see the boundaries are reestablished through this? The boundary of what belongs to Adonai, Tzvaot, Adonai in the heavens, the Lord of hosts, or the chatat being the sin offering, which goes partially to Adonai in the heavens, but also goes to the priest as part of his food. And then in the last case of a boundary is this other boundary of the Shlamim, which is a very open boundary, a non-exclusive boundary. Everyone's allowed to come into that space, into the Shlamim feast, in order to enter into the peace and enter into the rest, and so forth. So this is what we see. But again, do you remember the parable of the wedding feast when one was there and didn't have the right clothes and he was thrown out? The Shlamim offering, the peace offering, requires that you are pure in your presence before Adonai in order to go into this closeness. Again, all these things are reestablishing boundaries, but the underwriting characteristic of the sacrifices is this closeness. It is the korban, which means close or near to. And so I'm again very, very interested and fascinated with the depth of all these things and how they do interweave themselves into our understanding. It's very true. We don't have a temple, so we can't give a sacrifice. And you may have heard me discuss this before in an offhanded or flippant way. But the truth of the matter is I make this kind of korbanot, this closeness to Adonai, when I approach him in thanksgiving with an offering of an olah praise, which is where I give him everything, or an offering of chatat praise, where I confess my sin over my sacrifice and give it up to him, or shlamim when I share the offering and the sacrifice that Adonai has given to me. These things are all available to me, albeit in a different fashion, in the immediate. And all these things are the byproducts of my closeness with Adonai, and the process of bringing this kind of sacrifice in my heart to Adonai brings me into the presence of Adonai, that I might stand in the presence of Adonai, that now I have a reason, an undeniable summons to come into the presence of Adonai with the sacrifice of my heart. Thank you. Shalom, shalom. If you have any questions, please let me know, and would love to speak with you and discuss any of these things. And may Adonai bless you and give you a good week and a week of peace. And I will speak to you again soon. Shalom, shalom.